Today we'll journey back to the Middle Ages, a time when knights roamed the battlefields, pledged loyalty to their lords, and followed a strict code of honor known as chivalry. These legendary figures, clad in gleaming armor, have captured imaginations for centuries, symbolizing courage, loyalty, and justice. But who were these knights in reality? What shaped their lives, and how did they influence the world around them? Over the next sections, we'll uncover the origins of knighthood, explore the rigorous training required to achieve such a title, and delve into the ideals that define their lives. From thrilling tournaments to their roles in politics and religion, we'll paint a vivid picture of what it truly meant to be a knight in medieval Europe. So sit back, relax, and let the tales of chivalry transport you to a world of castles, lords, and heroic deeds. Let's begin. The origins of knighthood are deeply rooted in the shifting landscape of early medieval Europe. To truly understand how knights came to embody the ideals of chivalry and military prowess, we must first look at the turbulent centuries following the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. This was a time of political fragmentation, constant warfare, and social upheaval, a period where the idea of the knight as we know it began to take shape. In the early medieval world, the need for skilled mounted warriors became increasingly clear. The collapse of centralized Roman authority left Europe vulnerable to waves of invasions, from the Vikings in the north, the Magyars in the east, and the Moors in the south. In this context, local lords and rulers sought to defend their territories by assembling small, highly mobile armies of mounted fighters who could respond swiftly to threats. These warriors, equipped with swords, shields, and sturdy war horses, became the precursors to medieval knights. Initially, these mounted warriors were not bound by the ideals of chivalry or noble birth. They were primarily mercenaries or soldiers, serving their lords in exchange for land or wealth. Feudalism, the dominant social system of medieval Europe, provided the framework for this relationship. Lords granted fiefs, tracts of land, to their most trusted warriors, who in turn pledged their loyalty and military service. This mutual dependence between lord and vassal laid the groundwork for the social and economic role of knights. As time went on, the status of these mounted warriors began to evolve. By the 9th and 10th centuries, a growing emphasis on Christian values and martial discipline began to reshape their identity. The Church, recognizing the chaos of the age, sought to temper the violence of these warriors with moral guidance. Clergy introduced concepts such as the peace of God and the truce of God, which called on warriors to protect the weak, refrain from violence on holy days, and conduct themselves with honor. These principles would later influence the chivalric code, giving knighthood a moral and spiritual dimension. The figure of the knight as a nobleman tied to both martial skill and moral virtue truly emerged during the 11th century. This transformation was closely linked to the Crusades, a series of holy wars initiated by the Church to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. The Crusades provided a stage for knights to demonstrate their bravery and devotion, earning not only worldly rewards, but also spiritual salvation. Many of the ideals we associate with knights, courage, loyalty, and piety, were amplified during this period. It was also during the 11th and 12th centuries that the concept of hereditary knighthood began to take hold. While early knights were not necessarily of noble birth, the privileges and responsibilities of knighthood increasingly became tied to the aristocracy. Wealthy families could afford the expensive armor, weapons, and horses required to maintain the knightly lifestyle, solidifying their position within the feudal hierarchy. Sons of nobles were groomed from a young age to follow in their father's footsteps, ensuring the continuity of the knightly tradition. Knighthood was not just a military status, it became a cultural and symbolic identity. The image of the knight as a protector of the weak, a servant of the church, and a paragon of virtue began to permeate medieval literature and art. Epic poems like the Song of Roland and Arthurian legends like Le Morte d'Arthur celebrated knights as heroes, blending historical realities with romanticized ideals. These stories elevated knights to near mythical status, inspiring generations to emulate their deeds. Despite this idealized image, the reality of knighthood was often more complicated. Many knights were ruthless enforcers of their lord's will, engaging in plunder and violence without regard for the chivalric code. The tension between the ideals of knighthood and the realities of medieval warfare would remain a recurring theme throughout the Middle Ages. By the end of the 12th century, knighthood had become firmly established as a cornerstone of medieval society. It was a role defined not only by its military function, but also by its cultural, social, and religious significance. Knights were no longer just warriors. They were symbols of a broader set of values that sought to bring order and justice to a chaotic world. The origins of knighthood remind us that even the most romanticized aspects of history often emerge from practical needs. What began as a response to the demands of warfare evolved into a powerful institution that shaped the identity of medieval Europe. Knights were born from necessity, but came to represent ideals that transcended the battlefield, a legacy that still resonates in our imaginations today. The path to becoming a knight was a lifelong journey, often beginning in early childhood. For many boys born into noble families, the process started as early as 7 or 8 years old. At this age, they would leave their family home and enter the household of a lord. Here, they took on the role of a page, the first step in their training. Life as a page was both challenging and formative. These young boys were tasked with serving the members of the lord's household, learning proper manners and performing various duties such as delivering messages or assisting at meals. These seemingly simple tasks were intended to instill discipline, humility, and respect, qualities that would later define a knight's character. Beyond their domestic responsibilities, pages also began to develop the physical skills necessary for a future on the battlefield. Horsemanship was among the first lessons they learned, as a knight's prowess on horseback was vital to his success. In addition to riding, they practiced with wooden swords, learning basic techniques that would later evolve into mastery of the blade. Physical endurance and agility were honed through running, wrestling, and other exercises, ensuring that the boys grew strong and capable of bearing the weight of armor. As they matured, pages were introduced to the world of stories and ideals that would shape their future roles. They listened to epic tales of knights and heroes, stories filled with valor, loyalty, and sacrifice. These narratives, often steeped in Christian values, served to inspire young minds and reinforce the idea that knighthood was not just a profession, but a calling. Prayer and religious instruction were also an integral part of their daily lives, teaching them the importance of faith and their duty to uphold it. By the time a page reached his teenage years, typically around 14, he advanced to the rank of squire. This marked a significant transition, as the young man would now serve directly under an experienced knight. As a squire, his duties expanded considerably. He was responsible for maintaining his knight's armor and weapons, ensuring they were in perfect condition for both practice and battle. He cared for the knight's horse, a task that required both skill and dedication. The bond between a knight and his steed was sacred, and squires learned to treat these animals with the utmost respect. Life as a squire was demanding, but also exhilarating. They followed their knights into battle, observing firsthand the chaos and danger of combat. While not always permitted to fight in the thick of battle, squires would defend their knights if needed and assist in critical moments. These experiences provided them with invaluable knowledge about warfare, strategy, and the reality of knighthood. Lessons far removed from the romantic tales of bravery they had grown up hearing. The training of a squire was not confined to the battlefield. During peacetime, they participated in tournaments, which served as both practice and a showcase of their skills. These events allowed squires to demonstrate their prowess in jousting, swordplay, and other martial arts before crowds of nobles. It was a chance to earn recognition and perhaps the favor of a lord or lady who might support their future knighthood. When the time came for a squire to become a knight, the transition was marked by a solemn and deeply symbolic ceremony. On the eve of his knighting, the squire would undertake a vigil, spending the night in prayer and reflection. Clad in white to symbolize purity, he would kneel in a chapel, seeking divine guidance for the responsibilities ahead. The following day, the formal ceremony took place. In the presence of lords, ladies, and clergy, the squire would kneel before his lord or king. With a gentle tap of a sword on each shoulder, he was proclaimed a knight, ready to uphold the ideals of chivalry and serve with honor. The journey from page to knight was not merely a process of physical training. It was a profound transformation of character and purpose. Each step, from the early lessons of service to the final ritual of knighthood, was designed to shape individuals into warriors who embodied the highest ideals of their time. It was a path that demanded not only strength and skill, but also humility, devotion, and an unwavering sense of duty. For those who succeeded, the title of knight was more than an honor. It was a lifelong commitment to the values they had spent years cultivating. Knighthood was more than just a title or a profession. It was a way of life shaped by the ideals of the chivalric code. This unwritten set of principles guided knights in their actions on the battlefield, their interactions within society, and their personal conduct. It was a moral compass, a blend of martial, religious, and social values that knights were expected to uphold. However, like all ideals, the chivalric code often clashed with the realities of medieval life, creating a fascinating tension between aspiration and practice. At the heart of the chivalric code was the expectation of loyalty. A knight's first duty was to his lord, to whom he swore an oath of fealty. This bond was not just symbolic, it was the foundation of the feudal system. Knights were expected to protect their lord's lands, enforce his authority, and when necessary, fight in his name. In return, the Lord provided them with land or other rewards, creating a mutually beneficial relationship. Loyalty extended beyond the Lord, encompassing the knight's duty to his comrades in arms, his family, and even his enemies, through the concept of honorable combat. Another cornerstone of chivalry was courage. Knights were warriors, and bravery in the face of danger was essential. Whether on the battlefield or in a jousting arena, they were expected to confront challenges without hesitation. This courage was often intertwined with a sense of justice, as knights were charged with defending the weak and upholding the law. The ideal knight was not merely a skilled fighter, but a protector of the helpless, a shield against oppression. Piety was another defining feature of the chivalric code. The church played a significant role in shaping the identity of knights, emphasizing their role as defenders of Christendom. Knights were encouraged to attend Mass, participate in religious observances, and seek spiritual guidance. Many took vows to protect pilgrims, defend holy sites, and fight in the name of their faith, particularly during the Crusades. This religious devotion elevated knighthood from a military role to a spiritual calling, imbuing their actions with divine purpose. The chivalric code also extended to a knight's personal conduct, particularly in matters of courtly love. The ideal knight was expected to show respect and reverence toward women, especially those of noble birth. Tales of chivalrous knights often featured themes of unrequited love, devotion to a lady, and acts of service performed in her honor. These stories, while romanticized, reflected the broader expectation that knights would conduct themselves with grace and dignity, balancing their martial prowess with gentler virtues. Despite its lofty ideals, the chivalric code was not always followed to the letter. The realities of medieval warfare often demanded ruthlessness, and knights were as capable of committing acts of cruelty as they were of displaying heroism. Loyalties could be fragile, with knights occasionally betraying their lords for personal gain. The concept of defending the weak sometimes gave way to self-interest, particularly during times of political turmoil or economic hardship. Furthermore, the expectations of piety and courtly behavior could be selective. While some knights genuinely strove to embody these virtues, others used the trappings of chivalry to mask less noble intentions. The Crusades, for example, were framed as holy wars, yet they often involved pillaging and power struggles that had little to do with religious devotion. Similarly, the ideal of courtly love was more a product of literature than a reflection of everyday life, where marriages were often arranged for political or economic reasons rather than romance. This gap between ideal and reality is part of what makes the chivalric code so intriguing. It was not a fixed set of rules, but a collection of aspirations that knights sought to live up to, with varying degrees of success. The stories of knights who fell short of these ideals are just as compelling as those who embodied them, offering a nuanced view of what it meant to be a knight in medieval Europe. In the end, the chivalric code served as both a guide and a challenge. It held knights to a higher standard, inspiring them to strive for greatness while reminding them of their human imperfections. Even today, the legacy of chivalry continues to resonate, embodying values that transcend the medieval world and speak to timeless questions of honor, loyalty, and morality. Knighthood was more than just a title or a profession. It was a way of life shaped by the ideals of the chivalric code. This unwritten set of principles guided knights in their actions on the battlefield, their interactions within society, and their personal conduct. It was a moral compass, a blend of martial, religious, and social values that knights were expected to uphold. However, like all ideals, the chivalric code often clashed with the realities of medieval life, creating a fascinating tension between aspiration and practice. At the heart of the chivalric code was the expectation of loyalty. A knight's first duty was to his lord, to whom he swore an oath of fealty. This bond was not just symbolic, it was the foundation of the feudal system. Knights were expected to protect their lord's lands, enforce his authority, and when necessary, fight in his name. In return, the Lord provided them with land or other rewards, creating a mutually beneficial relationship. Loyalty extended beyond the Lord, encompassing the knight's duty to his comrades in arms, his family, and even his enemies, through the concept of honorable combat. Another cornerstone of chivalry was courage. Knights were warriors, and bravery in the face of danger was essential. Whether on the battlefield or in a jousting arena, they were expected to confront challenges without hesitation. This courage was often intertwined with a sense of justice, as knights were charged with defending the weak and upholding the law. The ideal knight was not merely a skilled fighter, but a protector of the helpless, a shield against oppression. Piety was another defining feature of the chivalric code. The Church played a significant role in shaping the identity of knights, emphasizing their role as defenders of Christendom. Knights were encouraged to attend Mass, participate in religious observances, and seek spiritual guidance. Many took vows to protect pilgrims, defend holy sites, and fight in the name of their faith, particularly during the Crusades. This religious devotion elevated knighthood from a military role to a spiritual calling, imbuing their actions with divine purpose. The chivalric code also extended to a knight's personal conduct, particularly in matters of courtly love. The ideal knight was expected to show respect and reverence toward women, especially those of noble birth. Tales of chivalrous knights often featured themes of unrequited love, devotion to a lady, and acts of service performed in her honor. These stories, while romanticized, reflected the broader expectation that knights would conduct themselves with grace and dignity, balancing their martial prowess with gentler virtues. Despite its lofty ideals, the chivalric code was not always followed to the letter. The realities of medieval warfare often demanded ruthlessness, and knights were as capable of committing acts of cruelty as they were of displaying heroism. Loyalties could be fragile, with knights occasionally betraying their lords for personal gain. The concept of defending the weak sometimes gave way to self-interest, particularly during times of political turmoil or economic hardship. Furthermore, the expectations of piety and courtly behavior could be selective. While some knights genuinely strove to embody these virtues, others used the trappings of chivalry to mask less noble intentions. The Crusades, for example, were framed as holy wars, yet they often involved pillaging and power struggles that had little to do with religious devotion. Similarly, the ideal of courtly love was more a product of literature than a reflection of everyday life, where marriages were often arranged for political or economic reasons rather than romance. This gap between ideal and reality is part of what makes the chivalric code so intriguing. It was not a fixed set of rules, but a collection of aspirations that knights sought to live up to, with varying degrees of success. The stories of knights who fell short of these ideals are just as compelling as those who embodied them, offering a nuanced view of what it meant to be a knight in medieval Europe. In the end, the chivalric code served as both a guide and a challenge. It held knights to a higher standard, inspiring them to strive for greatness while reminding them of their human imperfections. Even today, the legacy of chivalry continues to resonate, embodying values that transcend the medieval world and speak to timeless questions of honor, loyalty, and morality. While the battlefield was the ultimate test of a knight's abilities, tournaments offered a stage where skill, courage, and honor could be demonstrated in a more controlled and celebratory setting. These grand events were not only an essential part of medieval life, but also a spectacle that brought together nobility, commoners, and knights in a shared admiration of martial skill and chivalric ideals. Tournaments emerged during the 11th and 12th centuries, initially as chaotic mock battles known as melees. In these early forms, large groups of knights would divide into teams and engage in simulated combat that closely resembled real warfare. Armed with blunted weapons, they charged at one another on horseback, grappling, striking, and seeking to unseat their opponents. The goal was to capture and hold fellow knights for ransom, mimicking the practices of actual warfare. These melees were often wild and dangerous, with injuries and even deaths not uncommon. Over time, tournaments became more structured and ceremonial, reflecting the growing emphasis on chivalric ideals. By the 13th century, they had evolved into highly organized events, often held in the courtyards of castles or specially prepared fields. Lords and kings sponsored these tournaments, using them not only to showcase the prowess of their knights, but also to demonstrate their wealth and influence. For the participants, tournaments were an opportunity to gain prestige, prove their loyalty, and even secure favor in the eyes of a potential patron. One of the most iconic elements of tournaments was the joust. In this dramatic event, two knights would charge at each other on horseback, wielding long lances. The objective was to strike the opponent with enough force to unseat them or break the lance against their armor, demonstrating precision and strength. The joust became the centerpiece of many tournaments, drawing the largest crowds and inspiring admiration for the skill and bravery of the participants. Spectators, often including nobles and royalty, cheered for their champions, adding an air of festivity to the competition. Beyond the joust, tournaments featured a variety of contests designed to test a knight's martial abilities. Sword fighting, duels, archery contests, and games that involved striking targets while on horseback were common. These events were as much about entertainment as they were about demonstrating skill. Knights competed not only for prizes, often in the form of gold, armor, or horses, but also for honor and the approval of their peers. Tournaments were not merely displays of violence. They were imbued with pageantry and ritual. Before this competition began, knights often participated in elaborate ceremonies. They would don their armor with the assistance of squires, ensuring every piece was polished to a gleaming finish. Their shields and banners, bearing the symbols of their family or personal heraldry, were displayed proudly. Many knights entered the lists, the field of competition, with the blessing of a noble lady who might tie a ribbon or token to their lance as a sign of favor. The cultural significance of tournaments extended beyond the participants. For the spectators, these events were moments of celebration and unity. Vendors and entertainers would gather at the tournament grounds, creating an atmosphere reminiscent of a fair. Musicians played lively tunes, while storytellers recounted tales of legendary knights and their heroic deeds. For the nobility, tournaments were occasions to forge alliances, arrange marriages, and display their wealth through lavish feasts and banquets. Despite their festive nature, tournaments were not without risk. Even with blunted weapons, accidents could occur, sometimes resulting in serious injury or death. Knights face not only the physical dangers of combat, but also the pressure to uphold their reputation. A poor performance in the lists could damage a knight's standing among his peers, while a victory could elevate his status and secure his place in the annals of chivalric legend. As the medieval period progressed, tournaments became increasingly theatrical, blending combat with elements of drama and performance. Knights sometimes participated in themed events, dressing as characters from mythology or history. These spectacles, while still demanding skill and bravery, highlighted the growing role of tournaments as cultural and social events rather than purely martial exercises. By the late medieval period, tournaments had begun to change. Advances in weaponry and the decline of heavy cavalry reduced the practical importance of knightly combat. Yet tournaments continued to thrive as celebrations of tradition and pageantry. Even as gunpowder reshaped the battlefield, the ideals of chivalry and the image of the knight remained powerful symbols of the medieval world. The life of a knight was deeply intertwined with religion. In medieval Europe, faith was not just a personal matter, but a central pillar of society. For knights, who often represented the martial arm of their lords and kingdoms, religion served as both a source of moral guidance and a justification for their actions. The Church, with its immense influence, shaped the ideals of knighthood, merging the warrior's code with Christian values. From the earliest stages of their training, knights were taught that their role extended beyond the battlefield. They were protectors of Christendom, defenders of the Church, and champions of the weak and oppressed. Religious instruction was a fundamental part of their education, emphasizing virtues such as humility, charity, and piety. Many young squires spent hours in prayer or attended services where they were reminded of their divine duty to fight for justice and protect the innocent. One of the clearest expressions of a knight's religious devotion was the knighting ceremony itself. This solemn event often took place in a church or chapel, presided over by clergy. On the night before their investiture, prospective knights would participate in a vigil of prayer, fasting, and reflection. They would confess their sins, seeking spiritual cleansing before taking on the sacred responsibilities of knighthood. The next day, as part of the ritual, the squire would kneel before a lord or monarch, but the presence of clergy underscored the divine approval for their new role. The idea of a knight as a holy warrior reached its zenith during the Crusades. Beginning in the late 11th century, these religious wars called on knights to leave their homes and fight to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. The Church presented the Crusades as a sacred duty, promising spiritual rewards such as indulgences, remission of sins for those who participated. For many knights, the Crusades were seen as an opportunity to demonstrate their faith and loyalty to God while seeking glory and adventure. However, the reality of the Crusades was far more complex. While many knights genuinely believed they were fighting for a holy cause, others were motivated by personal ambition, the chance for plunder, or the promise of land and titles. The Crusades also exposed the darker side of religious zeal, as knights and armies committed acts of violence that starkly contrasted with the ideals of chivalry and Christian compassion. Despite these contradictions, the image of the knight as a defender of the faith endured, solidified by both church propaganda and popular legend. Religion also played a role in the daily lives of knights, even outside the context of war. Many knights were patrons of monasteries, churches, and religious institutions, using their wealth to support the spiritual life of their communities. Some knights joined religious orders, such as the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights. These groups combined the martial skills of knighthood with the vows of monastic life, dedicating themselves to the protection of pilgrims, the care of the sick, and the defense of Christian lands. Even for knights who did not join such orders, religious observance was a constant presence. They attended Mass regularly, carried religious symbols such as crosses or relics into battle, and sought the blessings of priests before engaging in combat. Victory in battle was often attributed to divine intervention, reinforcing the belief that knights fought with God's favor. Defeat, on the other hand, was seen as a punishment for moral failings or insufficient faith, prompting knights to seek repentance and rededicate themselves to their duties. The relationship between knights and religion was not without its complexities. While the Church sought to guide knights with teachings on humility and mercy, the realities of medieval warfare often conflicted with these ideals. Knights who were celebrated for their bravery on the battlefield might also be responsible for acts of cruelty or ambition that defied the Church's moral teachings. This tension between the spiritual and the earthly aspects of knighthood was a constant theme in medieval life, reflecting the broader struggles of a society striving to balance faith with power. Despite these contradictions, religion provided knights with a sense of purpose and identity. It framed their actions within a larger narrative, connecting their personal struggles to the eternal battle between good and evil. Through their faith, knights found a way to reconcile the violence of their profession with the ideals of chivalry, creating a legacy that continues to captivate the imagination. The bond between knights and religion was not merely a reflection of the medieval world. It was a defining feature of knighthood itself. During the Middle Ages, chivalry influenced not only battlefield conduct, but also the everyday interactions between knights and those around them, especially women. Within this chivalric tradition, the idea of courtly love emerged as a way to elevate a knight's devotion to a noble lady, often setting her on a pedestal as a figure of moral inspiration and even gentle authority. Although medieval society generally restricted women's legal and social opportunities, the courtly love tradition gave rise to stories and poems in which a lady's favor could spur remarkable acts of valor and courtesy. Troubadours, poets, and storytellers wove tales of knights who faced daunting quests, sacrificing comfort and safety to prove themselves worthy of a woman whose virtue and beauty were celebrated in almost spiritual terms. This literary phenomenon reflected an aspiration for higher ideals of behavior, even if it did not always mirror the practical realities of medieval life. In many narratives, the lady was depicted as distant or unattainable, yet she exerted real influence by demanding loyalty and a high moral standard. Her presence could transform a brash warrior into a more refined figure, mindful of his manners and ready to serve others with kindness and generosity. The admiration knights displayed was often framed by the notion that true love made men more virtuous, drawing them away from crude impulses and elevating their souls toward honorable deeds. While much of this was embellished in literature, it did subtly influence how women were perceived, particularly at court. Noble women sometimes seized these ideals to secure a measure of informal power. They hosted salons, sponsored troubadours, and offered patronage to writers who lauded chivalric virtues, thereby guiding cultural conversations in ways that could benefit their families and allies. Still, it's important to note that these romantic tales did not necessarily reflect widespread female empowerment. Most women continued to face entrenched social hierarchies and legal limitations. Wealthy or noble ladies fared better than their poorer counterparts, yet even they were generally subject to arranged marriages and restricted inheritance rights. Nevertheless, the courtly love tradition afforded some women a limited platform, particularly in diplomatic settings. Within aristocratic circles, a woman who embraced the ideals of refined love could serve as a mediator or hostess, using her status and networks to forge alliances and avert conflicts. This was especially true when she held a respected position at court or belonged to a ruling dynasty with significant political reach. In these cases, romanticized views of chivalry could blend with practical governance, allowing influential women to nudge outcomes in ways that suited their interests. Over time, literature that featured courtly love spread across Europe, shaping not just romances and epics, but also social expectations. Knights who pledged themselves to a lady were admired if they exemplified loyalty, courage, and respectful manners. These qualities contrasted sharply with the violence so common in feudal conflicts, underscoring a desire to see warriors guided by conscience rather than mere ambition. Many aristocrats embrace chivalric principles to polish their reputations, so they often surrounded themselves with narratives that highlighted noble deeds done in the name of love. This idealized version of knighthood contributed to a distinctive image of medieval society, one where women were not merely passive onlookers, but figures whose presence might refine a knight's spirit. Although the real conditions of medieval life rarely matched the lofty ideals upheld in courtly literature, the stories left their mark by prompting reflection on how men and women should interact. Chivalric texts embedded the idea that respect and courtesy were virtues worth celebrating, an early hint that women's dignity deserved recognition, even if the path to genuine equality was still centuries away. In this sense, the courtly love tradition stands as a testament to the complex role women played in chivalric culture, shaping it through both inspiration and patronage. By insisting on a certain standard of behavior, they left a quiet but lasting influence on the moral code of knighthood, ensuring that the ideals of chivalry reached beyond swords and shields and found expression in the realm of human relationships. So 1. Knights in the Middle Ages were not solely figures of warfare, charging into battle clad in armor and brandishing swords. Beyond the din of combat, they occupied social and political positions that shaped the structure of medieval society. The knightly class was deeply embedded in the feudal hierarchy, wherein lords granted lands known as fiefs to knights in exchange for military service. Yet this arrangement did more than provide revenue and status. It also positioned knights as local administrators, responsible for maintaining order. Knights often acted as mediators in disputes, overseeing the enforcement of laws and protecting the interests of their lords. Their ability to sustain peace or enforce authority reflected not just personal prowess, but also an allegiance to a broader network of obligations that extended beyond their immediate household. In many regions, knights were seen as the physical embodiment of social stability. They upheld regional security, collecting rents from peasants and ensuring that land was cultivated without interruption. Feudal obligations bound knights to their overlords, but those same obligations imposed duties to the common people as well. Knights were expected to defend the vulnerable, support the church, and adhere to a code of conduct that valued loyalty, courage, and fairness. These ideals sometimes clashed with the messy realities of medieval power struggles, where ambitions ran high and rival noble families jostled for territory. Nevertheless, knights were widely viewed as essential pillars of the feudal order, linking the aristocracy to the local communities that depended on them for protection. Knights also partook in the political life of their time through various forms of service at royal courts. They could act as envoys, negotiating on behalf of kings or high nobles, or serve as stewards of estates, managing finances and resolving conflicts over land or inheritance. Because of their recognized martial skill, knights were frequently called to guard castles or borderlands, securing strategic locations that underpinned a lord's or monarch's power. Consequently, knights became more than military assets. They were trusted advisors who, by virtue of loyalty and martial reputation, might speak candidly to those in command. A knight's standing within the feudal system thus hinged on more than skill with a sword. To retain influence, he often needed both political insight and diplomacy. Tournaments and social gatherings further extended a knight's role beyond battle. These events served as occasions for demonstrating skill, building alliances, and displaying wealth. The tournament circuit fostered camaraderie and cultivated a sense of collective identity among knights. While jousts and melees were sometimes rough and even fatal, they also offered opportunities to forge political bonds. Victories in the lists could bolster a knight's reputation, attracting the attention of powerful patrons or potential spouses. Such social capital was a key part of navigating the intricate web of medieval loyalties. In this environment, as a knight's renown could prove as valuable as his sword arm, influencing the way lords distributed favor or the marriages they arranged. Knights engaged in charitable works and patronage too. Religious devotion was interwoven with chivalric identity, and many knights supported the church by funding monasteries or hospitals, believing such actions would safeguard their souls. Others sponsored artisans, musicians, or writers contributing to the cultural life of their region. In doing so, knights solidified their status as community leaders who upheld both spiritual and earthly duties. Some knights were even part of military religious orders like the Templars or Hospitallers, uniting martial skill with a vow to protect pilgrims and uphold Christian ideals. Participation in such orders extended a knight's responsibilities onto a broader stage, where service was directed toward defending the faith and shaping the politics of crusading realms. Knighthood then encompassed a broad spectrum of obligations that went well beyond fighting. Through their feudal ties, knights formed a crucial link between commoners, noble houses, and ruling monarchs, each group vying for stability or expansion in a competitive age. Their influence reached into legal matters, estate management, and diplomatic missions, while their presence at courts and tournaments helped create social networks that defined the contours of medieval power. Knights had to balance martial prowess with the softer skills of governance, persuasion, and loyalty, ensuring their voices would be heard in councils and chambers where decisions affecting vast territories might be made. During the later Middle Ages, knights found their once unquestioned military dominance eroding in the face of new technology and shifting political structures. For centuries, armored cavalry charges had led armies to victory, supported by a feudal system in which knights held lands and power. However, innovations like the longbow and the early use of gunpowder gradually undercut the knight's strategic importance. Battles such as Crécy and Agincourt, where disciplined archers devastated mounted forces, demonstrated that skillful infantry and ranged weapons could outmatch heavily armored warriors. Even as knights adapted by fighting on foot or incorporating new tactics, the era of the unstoppable cavalry charge drew closer to its end. Military changes did not exist in a vacuum. Monarchs began centralizing power, creating standing armies and instituting more systematic taxation. This reduced the need for feudal levies, weakening the link between land ownership and knightly service. Instead of relying solely on local lords to raise troops, kings could pay professional soldiers, artillery specialists, and mercenaries. In return, knights found themselves struggling to maintain the high costs of armor, horses, and retainers. As the feudal order frayed, many had to compromise. Some joined mercenary companies, others turned toward administrative roles at court, and a few sought new ways to display their prowess through jousts and tournaments. Social upheavals further accelerated this transformation. The Black Death decimated populations, causing labor shortages and shifting economic power. Peasant revolts and growing urban centers disrupted medieval hierarchies, which had once favored landholding knights. Meanwhile, merchants and townspeople amassed wealth by means outside of feudal obligations, challenging the old assumptions that placed knighthood at society's apex. In this changing environment, titles and traditional privileges were no longer guaranteed pathways to influence. Knights might still command respect based on heritage, but their authority depended as much on negotiation and political maneuvering as on martial skill. Amid these changes, the cultural image of the knight did not simply vanish. If anything, it grew more romanticized. Troubadour songs, epic poems, and Arthurian legends cast knights in a glowing light, praising their chivalric qualities, devotion, courtesy, and unwavering bravery, even as gunpowder weapons and professional infantry reduced the practical value of heavy cavalry. Literature and art elevated the knight to a nearly mythical status. Courtly traditions continued in the form of elaborate tournaments where jousts and pageantry showcased horsemanship and heraldry. Rulers recognized the public appeal of knightly spectacle and sponsored such events to display power and cultivate loyalty. Knights, in turn, embraced these new roles, functioning as ceremonial guardians of chivalric ideals, rather than as the backbone of medieval warfare. By the end of the Middle Ages, the knight had evolved from a fearsome mounted warrior to a nostalgic emblem of a bygone age. Firearms and modern tactics would dominate the battlefields of the early modern period, leaving knights to adapt once more. Yet their legends persisted, filling chronicles and ballads with tales of gallantry and moral fortitude. In these stories, knights became timeless figures who upheld honor against all odds, protecting the weak and serving a noble cause. This enduring image stands in contrast to the messy realities of feudal obligations and brutal warfare. It underscores how, even as historical circumstances changed, the knight's symbolic power endured. Ultimately, the decline of the knight was less an abrupt collapse than a gradual shift in priorities, technology, and governance. Knights lost their unquestioned supremacy on the battlefield, but they gained a lasting place in cultural memory. Stories of their heroism continued to resonate, fueling imaginations and shaping ideals of courage and virtue for centuries to come. In this way, knights may have faded as practical military assets, but they rose to immortality in legend. A transformation that reveals how society preserves certain values long after their original context has disappeared.